Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. That it's quick and free. And it is the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic and emotional stories like this one. Your support truly means the world to us. Thank you. Let's start story today. The funny thing about justice is that it never rushes, but it always arrives. The first thing I noticed wasn't the flames. It was the smell. Wet pine, old cedar beams, and 60 years of family memories dissolving into smoke that rolled across my front yard before sunrise. The orange glow reflected off the windows of every house on my street, while the steady hiss of fire hoses echoed through the quiet neighborhood like distant rain. I stood barefoot on the cold gravel shoulder wearing an old gray sweatshirt, watching firefighters do everything they could to save a home that was already gone. The heat pressed against my face from nearly 50 feet away, carrying tiny flecks of ash that drifted through the air like dark snow. My grandfather built that house in 1964 with his own hands after returning from military service. Every porch board had a story. Every scratch in the hardwood floor belonged to someone in my family. By the time the sun finally broke over the trees, nothing remained except a blackened chimney, twisted metal, and the stubborn outline of a front porch that refused to disappear. Then I heard the click of expensive heels on the sidewalk behind me. Margaret Whitmore, our HOA president. White designer jacket. Perfect blonde hair that somehow looked untouched despite standing only yards from a smoking ruin. The sweet perfume she always wore floated through the burnt air so sharply that it almost covered the scent of soaked lumber. Almost. She folded her arms and offered the kind of smile that people mistake for kindness until they look into the eyes behind it. Such a terrible tragedy. She whispered softly enough for the neighbors to hear, but loudly enough for me to catch every word. Maybe now the community can finally move forward. I didn't answer. I simply watched the reflection of the dying fire dance across her sunglasses. You learn a great deal about people when they think your life has collapsed. Some comfort you. Some help you. Others quietly celebrate because your loss makes their world look a little prettier. Margaret belonged to the third group. She had spent the better part of 2 years trying to force me out of Cedar Ridge Estates. According to her, my century-old oak trees blocked scenic views. My detached workshop looked outdated. My wraparound porch wasn't consistent with modern architectural standards. The violation letters arrived like clockwork every month. Paint color, fence height, landscaping, holiday decorations. Even the American flag my father raised every Memorial Day somehow became an issue after she rewrote another section of the HOA handbook. Every meeting ended the same way. She smiled. I stayed calm. She expected shouting. She expected threats. Instead, I documented every conversation, every certified letter, every inspection notice, and every strange coincidence that followed. The neighbors probably assumed I was simply too quiet to fight back. Margaret certainly did. She mistook patience for weakness and confidence for surrender. As firefighters packed away hoses and investigators placed bright yellow tape around what remained of my property, she lingered near the crowd, shaking hands and collecting sympathy as though she were the victim. I noticed something almost nobody else did. Every time an investigator walked toward the ashes, her shoulders stiffened for just a second before she relaxed again. It lasted less than a heartbeat, but I caught it. Small details have a way of surviving long after buildings disappear. By noon, the insurance representatives had arrived. By afternoon, reporters were filming from across the street. By evening, my home had become the biggest story in the county. Everyone wanted to know how such an old house could vanish overnight. Everyone had an opinion. Faulty wiring, lightning, old construction. Nobody asked why the neighborhood's loudest critic seemed unusually interested in every update. I loaded the last unburned box from my garage into the trunk of my sedan. Inside that box rested a worn silver pocket watch that had belonged to my father. Smoke-stained, scratched, still ticking. I closed the lid carefully and looked back one final time at the empty foundation where 3 generations of my family had laughed, celebrated holidays, and built a life together. Margaret believed she had erased my past. She had no idea she had just written the first page of her own ending. The county fire investigator spent less than 20 minutes walking through the remains before quietly telling me that the official report would take several weeks. I thanked him, shook his hand, and watched his truck disappear down Cedar Ridge Drive until the flashing lights became tiny red dots against the morning traffic. Most people assumed I had nowhere to go after losing my home, but they were wrong. I checked into a small historic hotel about 12 miles away where nobody knew my name and nobody cared why a man arrived carrying one suitcase and a smoke-stained wooden box. The room overlooked the courthouse square, although that meant nothing to anyone except me. Every morning I woke before sunrise, brewed terrible coffee from the machine beside the television, opened a leather notebook, and wrote down every detail I could remember from the past 2 years. Dates, times, conversations, certified letters, vehicle license plates, meeting minutes. Every tiny fact mattered because memory fades, but written records do not. That habit had followed me for decades. I never trusted emotion when facts were available. My father used to tell me that truth was strongest when it could stand on paper without anyone raising their voice. I had lived by those words my entire adult life. People often mistake quiet people for harmless people. They assume silence means fear. In reality, silence usually means observation. Margaret never understood that difference. She believed every unanswered insult was another victory. Every ignored violation notice convinced her she had finally broken my spirit. She never imagined I simply refused to waste energy arguing with someone who loved creating conflict. By the end of that first week, neighbors began stopping by the property to stare through the yellow tape. Some brought flowers. Others brought casseroles. A retired couple from 3 houses away handed me a family photograph they had rescued from my mailbox after the fire department finished working. The edges were blackened, but the picture still showed my parents smiling on that same front porch nearly 30 years earlier. I thanked them sincerely because genuine kindness deserves to be remembered. Margaret also visited almost every day. She always arrived carrying a clipboard, speaking in the polished voice she reserved for cameras and public meetings. She told reporters the community was united. She promised the HOA would help maintain neighborhood standards during the cleanup. She even suggested the empty lot could become a beautiful green space if rebuilding proved too difficult. Every sentence sounded compassionate until you realized none of it included asking what I wanted. She had already begun planning my future without me. One afternoon, I returned to the property to meet an insurance adjuster. As we walked around the foundation, he paused beside the old brick walkway leading toward what had once been my front door. He frowned, knelt, and pointed toward a section of concrete that looked oddly clean compared to everything surrounding it. Rain, soot, and ash covered almost every inch of the property except for one narrow strip where faint tire marks remained visible. He photographed them without saying much. I noticed Margaret watching us from across the street. She smiled when our eyes met, but her smile disappeared the moment the adjuster took another photograph. Again, it lasted only a second. Again, it told me far more than words ever could. That evening, I received 3 separate phone calls from attorneys offering to represent me in lawsuits against the HOA, the insurance company, or anyone else with deep pockets. I politely declined every offer. Their confusion was almost amusing. They assumed I had no legal guidance. They assumed I needed someone else to tell my story. They did not know there were already people quietly reviewing documents that had nothing to do with civil lawsuits. I never lied to anyone. I simply answered only the questions people actually asked. There is an important difference between hiding the truth and choosing the proper moment to reveal it. My profession had taught me that timing could determine whether justice merely appeared fair or truly was fair. So I waited. While Margaret celebrated what she believed was the final chapter of my life in Cedar Ridge, I continued doing exactly what I had always done. I listened more than I spoke. I collected facts instead of rumors. I watched patterns instead of personalities. And with every passing day, the picture became just a little clearer, because fires may reduce a house to ashes, but they also have a remarkable way of illuminating everything people thought would stay hidden forever. The second week after the fire brought an unexpected kind of silence. Reporters moved on to fresher headlines. Neighbors returned to their routines, and the smell of smoke slowly faded from Cedar Ridge estates. But Margaret Whitmore did not stop. If anything, she became even more confident. Without my house standing behind me, she behaved as though the neighborhood already belonged to her. One Monday morning, I attended an open HOA board meeting simply to observe. I sat in the last row wearing an ordinary navy sport coat with a legal pad resting on my lap, while Margaret stood at the front of the clubhouse beside a polished wooden podium. Behind her hung a framed photograph of the neighborhood entrance beneath the words Pride, Standards, Community. She spoke with polished confidence, thanking everyone for their patience during what she called an unfortunate incident before smoothly shifting the discussion toward future improvements. Then she introduced a proposal to purchase my burned property through an affiliated investment group so that the land could be converted into a landscaped commons with decorative walking paths. Several homeowners exchanged uncertain glances. One elderly man politely asked whether I had agreed to sell. Margaret smiled without missing a beat. She answered that some owners eventually realize rebuilding is simply not practical after such devastating losses. She never mentioned that I had not listed the property for sale, had never contacted a real estate broker, and had never expressed any intention of leaving. Listening quietly from the back of the room, I realized this meeting was never about landscaping. It was about creating a public narrative before the facts had a chance to catch up. As soon as the meeting ended, several board members gathered around Margaret. They lowered their voices, but years of listening carefully had taught me to notice far more than words. One member looked uncomfortable every time my name surfaced. Another repeatedly asked whether all the paperwork had been completed. Margaret answered with reassuring confidence that everything was under control. Confidence can be persuasive, especially when nobody asks difficult questions. I walked outside into the warm afternoon sunlight and found a handwritten note tucked beneath the windshield wiper of my sedan. There was no signature, only a single sentence. Check the association maintenance records from last October. Most people would have dismissed it as meaningless. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my notebook beside dozens of other documents. Anonymous information is never evidence by itself, but it often points toward evidence waiting to be discovered. Later that afternoon, I visited the county records office. Public documents have always fascinated me because they tell stories without emotion. Property permits, contractor licenses, maintenance contracts, inspection reports, and meeting minutes rarely lie. They simply wait for someone patient enough to connect them. After nearly 3 hours of reading through archived records, one small detail caught my attention. The HOA had approved emergency maintenance near the utility easement bordering my property several months before the fire. The paperwork itself appeared ordinary, but the contractor listed on the authorization shared a mailing address with a property management company that had recently submitted an unsolicited purchase inquiry for my land. Coincidences exist, but experienced professionals learn not to build conclusions from coincidences alone. Instead, they ask better questions. I requested additional public records and quietly left the building carrying a folder that looked almost disappointingly thin. Meanwhile, Margaret seemed determined to convince everyone that I had already accepted defeat. She spoke confidently to neighbors, arranged landscaping estimates around the empty lot, and even suggested changing the neighborhood map for the next annual homeowners directory. Every step moved just a little faster than common sense would recommend. People driven by patience rarely reveal themselves. People driven by urgency often do. That evening, I spread every document across the desk in my hotel room beneath the soft yellow lamp beside the window. The silver pocket watch rested near the corner, still keeping perfect time despite everything it had survived. I traced a finger across the handwritten note, then compared dates, addresses, signatures, and meeting agendas until nearly midnight. Individually, none of the pieces proved anything. Together, they began forming a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. Margaret believed she was directing the story because she controlled the loudest voice in the neighborhood. She still had no idea that I had stopped listening to her words days ago. I was listening to the paper trail instead, and paper has a remarkable habit of speaking with absolute honesty once every page is finally placed in the correct order. 3 days later, the first official reports began arriving, and almost every one of them raised more questions than answers. The insurance company assigned a senior investigator instead of the usual adjuster, explaining that the circumstances required a more detailed review before any final determination could be made. I welcomed the delay. Rushed conclusions have a habit of overlooking inconvenient details, while careful investigations usually discover them. Early one Thursday morning, I returned to the property after a light rain had washed away much of the loose ash. The air still carried a faint smoky scent, but another smell had replaced it. Freshly cut grass. Someone from the HOA maintenance crew had already trimmed the common areas surrounding my lot as though they were preparing the neighborhood for a real estate brochure instead of respecting an active investigation. The contrast felt almost surreal. Yellow evidence tape fluttered in the breeze while lawn equipment hummed only a few yards away. I watched two maintenance workers load their tools into a truck before one of them quietly approached me. He glanced over his shoulder to make certain nobody else was listening. Then he spoke so softly I almost missed his words. He told me the board had instructed the landscaping company to create preliminary sketches for the property before the fire investigation was even complete. When I asked when those instructions had been given, he hesitated for a moment before answering, nearly 2 weeks earlier. I thanked him without asking another question. People who decide to tell the truth usually reveal more when they never feel pressured. As his truck disappeared around the corner, I stood perfectly still, replaying his answer in my mind. 2 weeks earlier, long before anyone could reasonably know whether I intended to rebuild or remain in the neighborhood. That afternoon, I visited the county planning office again. Public records rarely produce dramatic discoveries all at once. Instead, they reward persistence. A clerk recognized me from my earlier visit and smiled sympathetically before placing another stack of documents on the counter. Buried among permit requests and contractor filings was a preliminary concept drawing submitted by a consulting firm hired by the HOA. The date in the upper right corner caught my attention immediately. The proposal had been prepared before the fire investigators completed their initial inspection. The drawing showed walking paths, decorative benches, flower beds, and an open gathering space located precisely where my home had stood for decades. It was labeled as a future community enhancement project pending property acquisition. Acquisition, not negotiation, not discussion. Acquisition. That single word lingered in my thoughts during the drive back to the hotel. Language matters because words often reveal intentions long before actions become obvious. By Friday evening, another unexpected piece of the puzzle arrived. My insurance. Investigator called to explain that several security cameras from neighboring businesses had captured vehicles entering and leaving the subdivision throughout the night before the fire. The recordings were being preserved as part of the normal review process. He did not speculate about what they might show, and neither did I. Facts deserve patience before interpretation. After ending the call, I placed the phone beside my father's silver pocket watch. Its steady ticking filled the quiet hotel room with the same calm rhythm that had accompanied me since childhood. Whenever difficult decisions approached, my father used to rest that watch on the kitchen table and remind me that time exposes what emotion tries to hide. Those words had never felt more relevant. Meanwhile, Margaret continued presenting herself as the calm voice of leadership. She organized neighborhood gatherings, spoke confidently about rebuilding community spirit, and thanked volunteers for supporting residents during difficult times. Every public appearance polished her reputation a little more. Every carefully chosen sentence encouraged people to see her as the person solving problems instead of asking who might have benefited from them. But appearances have limits. They can influence opinions, yet they cannot rewrite records, erase dates, or silence documents already filed with government offices. Late that night, I arranged every new page beside the earlier records until the hotel desk disappeared beneath neatly organized folders. Property proposals, maintenance authorizations, contractor information, meeting agendas, and handwritten notes slowly aligned into a timeline that felt less accidental with every passing hour. I still lacked one crucial piece that transformed suspicion into certainty, so I refused to draw conclusions before the evidence deserved them. Patience remained my strongest ally. Margaret believed she was several moves ahead because she measured success by public perception. She had no reason to suspect that the real contest had quietly shifted away from neighborhood meetings and newspaper headlines. It was now unfolding inside files, timestamps, official records, and carefully preserved evidence, where confidence meant nothing and every page would eventually have to answer the same simple question: who knew what, and exactly when did they know it? The breakthrough arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, disguised as an ordinary envelope with no return address. It had been slipped beneath the door of my hotel room sometime during the morning, and inside was a single flash drive wrapped in a plain sheet of notebook paper. Across the front, written in careful block letters, were only 6 words. She never deletes anything she values. I stared at the message for several seconds before sliding the drive into my laptop. It contained no dramatic confession, no secret recording, and no obvious smoking gun. Instead, it held archived copies of HOA newsletters, internal committee calendars, vendor invoices, and meeting schedules that had apparently been downloaded months earlier. At first glance, the files seemed almost painfully ordinary. But ordinary documents often become extraordinary when someone compares them against official records. I spent the next several hours doing exactly that. Every invoice received a date. Every calendar entry found its place on a timeline. Every contractor listed in one document was matched against permits, public filings, and maintenance requests I had already collected. Slowly, almost quietly, separate pieces began fitting together with a precision that could not be ignored. One landscaping consultant appeared repeatedly under different company names. A maintenance supervisor signed approvals for work that board minutes never officially discussed. Several planning meetings had taken place before homeowners were ever informed that proposals existed. None of those facts proved wrongdoing by themselves, but together they demonstrated something important. Decisions had been unfolding behind closed doors long before the public story suggested they had even been considered. I leaned back in the chair and listened to the familiar ticking of my father's pocket watch resting beside the keyboard. The rhythm never changed. It reminded me to separate evidence from assumptions, because assumptions satisfy curiosity while evidence survives scrutiny. Late that evening, my telephone rang. The insurance investigator sounded noticeably more careful than during our previous conversations. He explained that forensic specialists had completed another stage of their examination and that several findings did not support the earliest theories about the origin of the fire. He refused to discuss details over the telephone, explaining that the complete report would first be shared with the appropriate authorities. His professionalism told me everything I needed to know. The investigation was becoming larger than an insurance claim. After thanking him, I closed my notebook without writing a single prediction. Experience had taught me never to outrun the facts. The following morning, I visited the county clerk's office again, where another unexpected discovery waited inside a routine property records request. Weeks before the fire, an inquiry had been submitted regarding future zoning flexibility for my parcel if ownership changed. The request carried no final approval and no immediate legal effect, but its timing was impossible to ignore. Someone had already been exploring what could happen after I no longer controlled the land. The question was no longer whether plans existed. The question had become who expected those plans to move forward so quickly. Meanwhile, Margaret continued smiling through neighborhood events as though nothing unusual had happened. She organized a volunteer cleanup day, posed for photographs beside freshly planted flowers near the subdivision entrance, and thanked residents for supporting one another through difficult times. Every appearance reinforced the image she wanted the community to believe. She spoke about unity, responsibility, and protecting property values with polished confidence. Yet every public statement stood in sharp contrast to the growing collection of dates, records, invoices, and correspondence quietly filling the folders inside my hotel room. Image and evidence were drifting farther apart every day. Then another small moment caught my attention. During an HOA committee meeting open to residents, one board member accidentally referred to my property as the future park before immediately correcting himself. The room fell silent for a brief second. Margaret laughed lightly, dismissed it as a harmless mistake, and smoothly redirected the conversation towards seasonal landscaping budgets. Most people accepted the explanation without another thought. I did not. People rarely reveal carefully guarded expectations unless those expectations have become familiar through repetition. That single phrase suggested conversations had been taking place long before the public had ever heard them. As evening settled over the courthouse square outside my hotel window, I organized every document into chronological order one final time. The timeline now stretched across the entire desk, beginning with harmless violation notices and ending with planning documents that appeared to anticipate my absence before the investigation itself had even reached its conclusion. I still refused to accuse anyone without proof strong enough to withstand every challenge. Justice demands discipline, not impatience. But for the first time since watching my family home disappear beneath smoke and ash, I could finally see the outline of the truth emerging with remarkable clarity. Somewhere inside those records remained the final piece that would connect preparation, opportunity, and intent, and I had a feeling it was much closer than anyone in Cedar Ridge Estates realized. The call came just after 8 o'clock on a gray Wednesday morning while I was reviewing another stack of public records beside the hotel window. It was brief, professional, and carefully worded. The county investigator informed me that several agencies would be coordinating the next phase of the inquiry and asked whether I would be available to provide additional documentation later that week. I answered that I would cooperate fully, thanked him for his time, and ended the conversation without asking a single unnecessary question. Curiosity has its place, but patience often uncovers more than impatience ever will. I looked across the courthouse square where people hurried through their ordinary routines carrying coffee cups and briefcases, completely unaware that dozens of seemingly insignificant documents were quietly converging into something much larger. My father's silver pocket watch rested beside the folder containing every note I had written since the fire. The steady ticking reminded me that truth rarely announces its arrival with noise. It simply appears when every piece finally reaches its proper place. Later that afternoon, I received formal notice that a hearing connected to several legal matters surrounding the investigation had been scheduled for the following week. The notice itself revealed very little, but one detail stood out immediately. The proceeding would take place in the federal courthouse downtown rather than the county building where most local property disputes were normally handled. That decision alone told me the scope of the investigation had expanded beyond neighborhood disagreements and insurance paperwork. Meanwhile, Cedar Ridge Estates continued operating as though nothing significant had changed. Margaret organized another community gathering outside the clubhouse, smiling confidently beneath neatly arranged banners celebrating neighborhood pride. She spoke about resilience, encouraged residents to focus on the future, and assured everyone that stability would soon return. Standing near the edge of the crowd, I watched homeowners applaud politely while conversations drifted from gardening projects to summer barbecues. A few neighbors approached me quietly afterward, offering sincere words of encouragement. Their kindness reminded me that communities are never defined entirely by their loudest voices. Most people simply want honesty, fairness, and peace. Margaret noticed those conversations from across the parking lot. She walked toward me carrying the same polished confidence she had displayed for months. Her expression suggested complete control. She asked whether I had finally decided what to do with the property, explaining that several families had expressed interest in seeing the neighborhood move forward. I smiled politely and answered with complete honesty. I told her that certain decisions would become much clearer after the upcoming court proceedings. For the first time since our conflict began, a faint look of uncertainty crossed her face. It disappeared almost instantly, replaced by another practiced smile, but I noticed it nonetheless. She expected arguments, emotional reactions, or desperate negotiations. Calm certainty unsettled her far more than anger ever could. 2 days later, I walked into the federal courthouse carrying nothing except a leather briefcase containing carefully organized records. The marble floors reflected the morning sunlight streaming through tall windows, filling the entrance with a quiet sense of permanence that I had always appreciated. Security officers greeted me with familiar professionalism before I continued toward a private corridor rarely used by members of the public. Several attorneys passed by without paying much attention. Clerks moved between offices carrying stacks of files. Everything unfolded with the orderly rhythm that accompanies institutions built upon procedure rather than emotion. I paused briefly outside a conference room where investigators reviewed documents collected during the previous several weeks. They accepted the additional records I had assembled, thanked me for preserving such detailed notes, and confirmed that the timeline had proven especially valuable in understanding the sequence of events. Again, no dramatic speeches were exchanged. Evidence speaks most clearly when nobody interrupts it. As the morning hearing approached, people slowly filled the courtroom. Attorneys arranged binders across counsel tables, while spectators settled quietly into polished wooden benches. Margaret entered several minutes later wearing an expensive navy suit that projected complete confidence. She greeted familiar faces, exchanged light conversation with her attorney, and glanced around the room with the relaxed expression of someone expecting another routine legal proceeding. Then her eyes found me standing near a side entrance. She smiled briefly, apparently assuming I had come simply to observe. I returned the gesture with the same calm expression I had carried since the day my home disappeared. A courtroom deputy stepped toward me and spoke softly enough that only those nearest could hear. "It is time, Your Honor." The words hung in the air with remarkable weight. I buttoned my black judicial robe, gathered the case materials from the deputy, and walked through the doorway leading toward the bench. Behind me, I heard the clerk announce the familiar instruction that every person inside the courtroom knew by heart. "All rise." When I stepped onto the bench and looked across the room, every person stood. Every person except Margaret, who remained completely motionless for one silent heartbeat before realizing exactly who I was and why I had never felt the need to argue with her outside that courtroom. The silence inside that courtroom lasted only a few seconds, but it felt longer than every HOA meeting Margaret Whitmore had ever chaired combined. I could see the exact moment confidence gave way to uncertainty. Her attorney leaned toward her and whispered something I could not hear, while she kept staring at the bench as though she expected the scene to change if she blinked enough times. It did not. Courtrooms do not operate on surprise. They operate on procedure. I took my seat, reviewed the docket placed before me, and looked across the room with the same impartial expression I had practiced throughout my career. Personal history has no place in judicial decision-making. The rule exists for a reason, and I intended to honor it completely. Before any substantive matter could begin, I addressed the issue that every experienced attorney already anticipated. I stated on the record that because I was personally connected to events surrounding one aspect of the broader investigation, I would immediately disclose that relationship and follow every ethical requirement governing judicial conduct. Transparency protects the integrity of the process, even when it creates inconvenience. The courtroom remained completely still as the disclosure was entered into the official record. Margaret looked relieved for a brief moment, apparently believing the entire matter would simply disappear. She misunderstood what was happening. My responsibility was never to decide the outcome of any investigation involving my own personal interests. My responsibility was to ensure that proper procedures had been followed from the very beginning and that every relevant matter reached the appropriate judicial channels without interference. Once those obligations had been completed, another judge, entirely independent from me, would preside over every issue connected to my property. That was exactly how the system was designed to work. The surprise was never that I intended to judge my own case. The surprise was that I had quietly helped preserve the integrity of the legal process long before anyone realized who I was. As the hearing continued, government attorneys summarized the procedural history leading to the expanding investigation. They described financial records, insurance documentation, contractor communications, and public filings that had been assembled over several weeks. None of the statements contained dramatic accusations. Instead, they reflected the careful language of professionals who understood that facts carry more weight than speculation. Several exhibits referenced timelines remarkably similar to the notebooks I had maintained since the first violation notice appeared in my mailbox years earlier. Listening to those dates unfold in precise chronological order reminded me why I had refused to argue during every confrontation with Margaret. Arguments disappear. Records remain. During a brief recess, I stepped into a private corridor where another federal judge greeted me with a warm handshake. He thanked me for making early disclosures before any conflict could arise and confirmed that reassignment orders had already been prepared in accordance with standard judicial procedures. We spoke only for a few minutes, but our conversation reinforced something my father had taught me decades earlier. Institutions remain trustworthy only when the people inside them willingly submit themselves to the same rules they apply to everyone else. That principle mattered far more to me than any personal satisfaction ever could. When proceedings resumed, additional filings were formally accepted into the record. Investigators explained that the inquiry had widened after inconsistencies appeared across multiple sets of documents obtained from independent sources. Vendor invoices, planning records, property inquiries, maintenance schedules, and communication logs would all receive further examination through the normal investigative process. No conclusions were announced that day. No final judgments were issued. The legal system was doing exactly what it was created to do, moving one verified fact at a time without allowing emotion to dictate the pace. Across the courtroom, Margaret no longer projected the effortless confidence that had once dominated every HOA meeting. She spent most of the afternoon quietly reviewing papers with her attorney while occasionally glancing toward the bench, perhaps trying to understand how someone she had dismissed as an ordinary homeowner had remained so composed throughout months of escalating pressure. The answer was simple. My confidence had never come from authority alone. It came from respecting procedure even when it demanded patience. By the time the hearing concluded, reassignment orders had been finalized, scheduling conferences had been established, and investigators left carrying several additional boxes of evidence collected during the previous weeks. As I removed my judicial robe in chambers later that afternoon, I rested my father's silver pocket watch beside it on the wooden desk. The steady ticking sounded exactly as it had the morning after the fire. Nothing about time had changed. What had changed was the direction of the story. Margaret had spent months believing she controlled the narrative because she controlled appearances inside the neighborhood. Now the narrative belonged to documented evidence, independent investigators, and a legal process that cared very little about popularity, influence, or carefully rehearsed speeches. For the first time since my home had been reduced to ashes, I knew with complete certainty that the truth no longer needed my protection. It had entered the record, and from that moment forward it would speak entirely for itself. The weeks that followed unfolded with remarkable quietness, at least on the surface. Cedar Ridge Estates looked exactly as it always had. Fresh flowers lined the entrance, sprinklers clicked across neatly. Trimmed lawns every morning, and families walked their dogs beneath the same towering oak trees that had witnessed everything without ever speaking. Yet beneath that calm exterior, the legal process continued moving with steady precision. Independent investigators interviewed contractors, reviewed financial records, compared electronic communications, and examined every document collected during the previous months. No headlines announced each development. No television cameras waited outside government offices. Real investigations rarely resembled dramatic performances. They advance one verified fact at a time until speculation is no longer necessary. Several members of the HOA board received formal requests for additional records. At first, they responded with complete confidence, insisting every decision had been properly documented. Then the requests became more specific. Meeting agendas were compared against calendar invitations. Vendor invoices were matched with bank transfers. Property planning proposals were examined alongside public filings and maintenance schedules. Small inconsistencies that had once appeared harmless began connecting to one another with surprising accuracy. One board member quietly resigned, explaining through a brief public statement that he wished to spend more time with his family. Another hired separate legal counsel before any formal accusations had even been announced. People often recognize the weight of evidence long before the public ever hears about it. Margaret, however, continued presenting the same composed image she had carefully maintained for years. She assured homeowners that routine administrative questions were being exaggerated and encouraged everyone to remain focused on protecting neighborhood values. But confidence is difficult to sustain when every passing week brings another official request for documents. Residents who had once accepted every explanation without question slowly began asking their own. Why had planning discussions occurred before homeowners were informed? Why had outside consultants prepared conceptual designs so early? Why had certain maintenance approvals never appeared in public meeting minutes? None of those questions required emotional speeches. They required answers supported by records. During that same period, my insurance investigator finally requested a closing meeting. We sat across from one another inside a modest conference room overlooking the county courthouse. He slid a neatly organized report across the table and explained that the company had completed its review. The investigation found no evidence suggesting negligence on my part. Instead, several findings had been forwarded to the appropriate authorities because they extended beyond the scope of a standard insurance claim. He spoke with quiet professionalism, thanked me for preserving detailed documentation from the beginning, and admitted that thorough personal records had significantly reduced the time required to establish the overall timeline. I accepted the report, shook his hand, and left the building carrying nothing more than another folder of carefully organized facts. Outside, the afternoon breeze carried the familiar scent of freshly cut grass through the courthouse square. For the first time in many weeks, that smell reminded me of possibility instead of loss. A short time later, the HOA announced an emergency meeting open to all residents. The clubhouse filled more quickly than I had ever seen before. Homeowners who had rarely attended previous meetings suddenly occupied nearly every chair. Margaret stepped to the podium wearing the same polished confidence that had once dominated every gathering, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Instead of accepting prepared statements, residents politely requested financial explanations, planning documents, and copies of board approvals. The questions remained respectful, yet each one narrowed the space available for vague answers. One longtime resident stood and asked why conceptual drawings for a community park had existed before anyone knew whether I intended to rebuild. Another asked why affiliated companies appeared repeatedly across different vendor contracts. Margaret attempted to reassure the room, but reassurance without documentation carries little weight once people begin reading records for themselves. By the conclusion of the meeting, several homeowners formally requested an independent audit of association operations in accordance with the governing bylaws. The motion passed with overwhelming support. Watching from the back of the room, I said nothing. There was nothing left for me to argue. The community had begun asking the questions that mattered because the evidence had quietly earned their attention. A few days later, I returned to my property just before sunset. The foundation remained exactly where it had always been, framed by yellow wildflowers that had somehow found their way through the soil after weeks of rain. I reached into my coat pocket and removed my father's silver pocket watch. Its steady ticking blended with the evening chorus of crickets drifting across the empty lot. I looked around the neighborhood and realized something important. My greatest victory would never be watching someone else lose influence or reputation. It was seeing an entire community rediscover the value of transparency, accountability, and truth. Buildings can always be rebuilt. Trust requires something much stronger, and at long last, Cedar Ridge Estates had finally begun laying its foundation. 6 months later, the first framing crew arrived just after sunrise. The sound of hammers echoed across the empty lot where silence had lived for far too long, and for the first time since that unforgettable morning, the air smelled of fresh lumber instead of smoke. I stood near the edge of the property, holding my father's silver pocket watch, while carpenters measured foundation lines with bright orange string stretched carefully across the ground. The old chimney had finally been removed, the damaged concrete replaced, and new plans approved without a single unnecessary delay. I chose to rebuild almost exactly where my grandfather had built the original house more than 60 years earlier. Some neighbors asked why I did not simply start over somewhere else. My answer never changed. Home is not the place where everything goes perfectly. Home is the place where truth deserves another chance. Cedar Ridge Estates had changed as well. Following the independent audit requested by homeowners, new board elections were held under updated governance procedures with expanded financial transparency requirements and stricter public disclosure rules. Several longtime residents volunteered to serve because they believed leadership should be based upon accountability instead of personal influence. Monthly meetings that once lasted less than 30 minutes now included open questions, published records, and detailed financial reports available for every homeowner to review. It was remarkable how quickly trust began returning once information stopped hiding behind closed doors. I attended one of those meetings quietly from the back of the room. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. People simply discussed budgets, landscaping, and maintenance with the understanding that every decision belonged to the entire community rather than a small circle of insiders. Walking out that evening, I realized that genuine authority never demands constant attention. It earns quiet confidence through consistent honesty. As for Margaret Whitmore, the neighborhood eventually stopped talking about her almost entirely. The legal matters connected to the broader investigation continued through the appropriate channels without dramatic public spectacles or sensational headlines. That was exactly how it should have been. Courts exist to evaluate evidence, not rumors. Investigators exist to establish facts, not satisfy curiosity. I never celebrated another person's legal difficulties because that was never the purpose of my journey. My goal had never been revenge. It had always been restoration. The greatest reward came from watching truth replace assumption and procedure replace intimidation. One cool autumn afternoon, nearly a year after the fire, I unlocked the front door of my newly completed home for the very first time. Sunlight poured through large windows onto polished hardwood floors crafted from reclaimed white oak. The wraparound porch looked almost identical to the one my grandfather had built decades earlier, except for one small addition. Above the entrance hung the restored brass house numbers that firefighters had recovered from the original foundation. They had been cleaned, carefully preserved, and mounted exactly where they belonged. Some scars deserve to remain visible because they remind us how far we have traveled. I carried the silver pocket watch into the living room and placed it inside a simple glass display case beside a framed photograph of my parents standing on the old front porch many years before. The watch had survived smoke, rain, and months inside a cardboard box, still keeping perfect time through every chapter of the story. I smiled because I finally understood why my father treasured it so deeply. Time does not heal by itself. Time simply gives truth enough room to catch up. Looking out across the neighborhood from my rebuilt porch, I saw children riding bicycles along sidewalks, neighbors greeting one another with easy smiles, and towering oak trees swaying gently beneath a clear blue sky. Life had moved forward, not because anyone forgot the past, but because people finally chose to learn from it. I often think back to that morning when I stood watching everything I loved disappear beneath drifting ash, while someone nearby believed my story had ended. She measured victory by what she could see in a single moment. I measured it by what would still remain when every document had been examined, every fact had been verified, and every person had been given a fair opportunity to speak. That difference changed everything. Justice never arrived with shouting, anger, or revenge. It arrived through patience, integrity, and the quiet strength of a system that works best when honest people trust it enough to let it work. Every time I hear the steady ticking of my father's pocket watch inside my new home, I remember the lesson that carried me through every difficult day. Power built upon fear eventually collapses beneath its own weight. Truth built upon evidence stands long after the noise has faded. And in the end, the house that mattered most was never the one rebuilt from lumber and stone. It was the one rebuilt inside an entire community that finally remembered the value of fairness, responsibility, and the simple courage to let justice take its proper course.